Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us this evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at the store, and I'm so pleased to see you here both in person and virtually for a very special night. We have the pleasure tonight of welcoming best-selling author, palliative care doctor, and trailblazer Kathryn Mannix here to the city. She's the author of Listen, How to Find the Words for Tinder Conversations, published by Harper Row, and With the End in Mind, Dying, Death, and Wisdom in an Age of Denial, published by Little Brown Company. We have a world-class brain trust here in the space, two individuals, including host Dr. Harvey Chochinov, who has spent their careers navigating the world of palliative care while foregrounding the care in that phrase with a significant side of deep intelligence, consideration, and warmth. They have also both made it their mission to generously share with others how they might do similarly and how we might face the end without fear and, indeed, with tenderness and dignity. All that to say, I realize no one is here to hear me speak, so I will be off the stage in just a moment. But just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Dr. Chochinov will come up here and will introduce tonight's featured guest. Following that, there'll be a conversation between the two of them. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. If you're here physically, please just put up your hand and I'll wander over to you with this microphone. Not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can hear your questions. And if you are one of those people watching from home, please feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat, and we will put them to our guests as time permits. At the end of the event, I'll just put one quick note in your head, and that's just that we'll ask you all to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Kathryn over to the signing table beside our cash desk, and I'll have more thrilling signing notes for you at the close of the event. But without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce your host for this evening. Harvey Max Chochinov, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Manitoba and Senior Scientist at Cancer Care Manitoba Research Institute. He is widely considered one of the most influential and respected palliative care scholars and researchers in the world today. He has authored over 300 publications, including several groundbreaking books in medicine. His achievements have been recognized nationally and internationally, including being named an officer in the Order of Canada and an inductee in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. His most recent book, Dignity in Care, The Human Side of Medicine, published by Oxford University Press, explores why being a patient is such a difficult pill to swallow and what healthcare providers can do to allow patients to retain their humanity, pride, and feelings of personhood. Please join me in welcoming Harvey Max Chochinov.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone here in this room and virtually. This is such an exciting evening and one that we've been thinking about and planning for a very, very long time. We've arranged for inclement weather, we have tea, and so all of Dr. Mannix's British sensibilities have been addressed. I asked Kathryn if she could provide me a few words that kind of describe her official bio. I will read some of that and embellish along the way. Kathryn is a British physician who spent 30 years working in palliative care, including big hospitals, hospice facilities, and inpatients' homes. She loved the medical work of symptom solving that gives people back the comfort to enjoy living, and the psychological work of supporting people making emotional sense of their circumstances. She took cognitive behavioral therapy training and developed CBT clinics in hospice settings, and also has the satisfaction of working with palliative care teams. Now, there was a segue here, and we'll be talking a lot about this segue in her career. She took early retirement to campaign for better public understanding of dying. And this retirement project has so far included radio, TV, 2 best-selling books, I believe on the London Times bestseller list, if I'm not mistaken, 3 TED Talks. Her YouTubes have been viewed millions of times, and that's not hyperbole, millions of views, as well as articles in newspapers, talks at literary festivals, appearances on podcasts around the world. And she's with us in Winnipeg as part of a lecture tour across Canada and a guest at Cancer Care Manitoba. And her talk at Cancer Care Manitoba and time here has been sponsored by the Renee D. Schwartz Endowment, and we're very indebted to the Schwartz family for the support. I met Kathryn online. I guess that's how people are meeting lately, right? It's a very modern kind of relationship. I met Kathryn online about a year and a half ago. We've been communicating ever since then. I read her book, first with the end in mind. And occasionally when people come up to me, especially young residents in the medical profession who are thinking about contemplating a career in palliative care, they ask if they can meet with me and if I might guide them. And I say, sure, let's set up a meeting. But between now and then, you need to read With the End in Mind by Kathryn Mannix. And by the time you finish reading it, if it really doesn't resonate, the truth is you don't want a career in palliative care and you don't have to bother meeting with me. I think with that, I am going to sit down with Kathryn and begin, or let's pick up the conversation that she and I started this morning when we met at Riverview. And we had a discussion in front of a group of the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority palliative care staff. So are you ready, Kathryn?
Ready.
You're ready and ready. Very good. Hello again.
Well, hello.
Yeah, this is lovely. This morning, you and I began the day with a conversation in front of a group of medical folks, talking actually about your career, what drew you to your career, various different pivotal events that helped shape you into the doctor you became. But I'm wondering if we might begin this evening with the segue, which is, how is it that after this wonderful 30-year career in medicine, you decided to step out of that clinical work and step onto the world stage?
Well, I think I need to make it clear that I didn't decide to step onto the world stage.
But it happened. It happened. It wasn't planned that way.
Yeah.
But...
Well, so it's all been a terrible accident. I decided to make a sideways move out of exasperation, really, that after 30 years of working in palliative care, I thought at the beginning that we would educate ourselves out of existence, that we would educate other medical professionals in the skills of symptom solving and psychological emotional support. And of course, they do increasing amounts of that, but we're discovering increasing things that we can do as well. So the body of knowledge gets too big to give away anymore. But more, I was disappointed that we were still having the same conversations with mortally sick people who expected that dying would be like something they'd seen on the television or in cinema, so dramatic by definition, that they were frightened about that, that they were worried about what their families would see, whether their families would be traumatized as they were watching them at the end of their lives. And the people were avoiding these really, really important conversations with each other that, you know, we're all gonna die. And it's not that it's optional, but we can be better or less well prepared for it depending on the attitude we take to it. So there was a particular event that I think tipped me over the edge, which was an elderly man coming into hospital in an ambulance with a crew pressing on his chest to keep his heart pumping, doing CPR on the way in. Came in with his wife in the ambulance and their 3 sons driving like that behind. And I met them in the emergency room with one of the nurses in the palliative care team I worked in, and it was clear that this man was not going to survive, that his heart had an electrical heartbeat on the screen, but the pump had just completely failed. He wasn't circulating any blood. And I said to his sons, you know, clearly your dad's been sick for a long time. I can see from the record he's been in and out of hospital a lot over the last year. what did he tell you he would want to happen if he was ever so sick that we thought he was dying? And there was this kind of very long, very shocked silence. And they said, oh, they've never talked about it. And then one of them said, actually, Dad did try to talk to me about it. And I said, Dad, don't be miserable. You know, you're still in good health. The doctors are looking after you. And I didn't let him talk about it. And this guy was clearly upset. You know, he was blinking to stop himself tearing up. He was clenching his jaw. And then his brother came to console him. So I'm from the northeast of England where men are manly. So the consolation.
Men aren't manly in other places.
So I won't comment about the town where I'm a guest. Because his brother came and stood next to him. He didn't look at him, he stood beside him. He reached his arm out and he patted his brother on the arm. That was the consolation. That's kind of like a man hug.
Mm.
And then he said, Dad asked me if I'd make out those power of attorney documents with him so that Mum wouldn't have to make all of the decisions on her own. I said, I tell you what, Dad, we'll do that to celebrate when you get to 100. So their mother then took control and said, listen, boys, so Dad is 97. The boys are in their 60s and 70s, but he's still their dad, and they can't bear the idea that he's dying. And that's part of this dynamic, isn't it? And she said, you know, we've talked about it a lot, and each of us hoped we'd be the first one to die so that we wouldn't be widowed. But clearly your dad's won. So we have to step back now and let what's going to happen and just love him and be with him. So they clearly had been talking about it. They clearly had got their ideas in place. But the sons, you know, proper grown-ups, absolutely distraught and unprepared for the imminent death of their dad. Mm. And it left me thinking, you know, we can't keep doing this, having this conversation, doing this preparation one family at a time. And we can't keep thinking that the palliative care services and the hospice services will have these conversations for us, or even that doctors and nurses and medical professionals will have this conversation for us. This is a much deeper rooted problem. It isn't a medical problem, it's a societal problem. And somebody needs to do something about the public misunderstanding about dying. And I spent the next few months kind of waking up in the morning thinking, somebody needs to do something. And walking along the corridors thinking, somebody needs to do something. And there was a kind of gradual, horrible, dawning realization, helped by a very clever friend of mine who asked a lot of really helpful questions to make me notice the experience I could bring to it. So I thought maybe I'd give it a go.
How did that turn out?
And so far, it's been a real roller coaster. So I wasn't sure what I'd do. I knew that I'd need to stop work to make the space to see what I would do. So I took early retirement, and my last week at work, I had what I thought was a spoof phone call from my friends saying it was the BBC. BBC Radio wants to talk to you. So obviously that's your friends playing a prank, right? So I answered the phone in that manner and then realised that this actually was somebody from the BBC. So then I had to kind of rejig, and they said, we heard that you're an expert in death. Which I don't think is a way I've ever described myself, if I'm honest. But they were looking for somebody for an interview program, and the team that was making the program didn't know where they would find someone that their person who was doing the interviews wanted to meet an expert who would answer all their questions about dying. And the editor rang her sister, who's a doctor, and said, I need an expert in death. And her sister said, oh, you need my friend Kath then. So on the basis of no obvious qualifications as far as the BBC is concerned, other than I'm a friend of the editor's sister, I got taken to London to be interviewed on the radio. And the literary agent heard the interview on the radio and got in touch to ask me whether I'd ever thought about writing a book. And that is kind of how it happened.
And the book was with the end in mind.
The book was with the end in mind. The book was originally the work in progress. This lovely person who got in touch became my agent, Andrew the agent. And when we were talking about titles, and he was talking about, when you need to be able to socialize people into picking it up on a bookshelf. So you wouldn't want anything unpleasant in the title, like you wouldn't want the D word or anything like that. I said, actually, Andrew, I think that's what we should call the book. So it was called The D Word to start off with. And it was only when the publishers kept getting feedback that people thought it might be a diet book or a book about navigating divorce that we had to come up with another title.
Wonderful. What do you think, what are the critical messages? What is it that you hope to impart in writing with death in mind? What is it that you wanted people to know, to hear, that you say that they hadn't heard up until then?
I think it's that we've slipped through all the generations now that we're familiar with dying. So my grandmother, who was born in 1900, at the age that I qualified from medical school at 24, when she was 24, she'd have seen dying up close and personal a lot of times. She'd have helped her sisters and her mum to look after people who were dying at home, because that's what happened. Well, by the time I was 24, I might have probably seen a few dead people after they died. And I might probably have seen a few people who were so sick now that the doctors stopped visiting them on the ward round because there was nothing more the doctors could do. So that's part of the problem we've got. But to actually see some of these final moments, I didn't know what final moments looked like. And I realized that my grandmother understood it because she'd seen it over and over again enough times to be able to work out what was the kind of arc of the process that was going on and what was individual to the particular person who was dying. So I thought if I could use stories to introduce people to a reader, it almost like in my head I was on a two-seater sofa with my reader. So I was sitting side by side, a bit like we're sitting now. And I'd be saying, okay, I want you to meet this person. Here they are. This is who they are. This is what they're about. These are the people who are important to them. This is the situation that they're in. So I want the person who's with me to really mind about this person and what happens, and then start to talk about the story. And what I have in mind is that we're all very familiar now with the process of giving birth. We have TV programs about it, we have dramas, we have documentaries. I'm sure you have them in Canada as well. So it's almost like we've reversed the Victorian thing of we can talk about dying, but reproduction, not so much. And that just like giving birth is a bodily process, and the body does it automatically, knows what to do. And every person who's ever given birth to a baby or babies has had an individual experience. But every midwife and obstetrician who's attended them has seen the same process that they always see. And it turns out that actually the process of dying also has recognizable phases, and they happen in a particular order. And if you're familiar with what that is, you can work out where the person is in it, how the timing is going, whether it's being properly managed in terms of symptom management or not. And then when they become deeply unconscious towards the end of their lives, which is how almost all of us die, and the brain switches into its automatic breathing cycles, which we've never seen. Because usually when a person's so sick that the brain makes that switch, we've got them on a ventilator. So to be sitting beside a person who's making unusual breathing noises, we need to be midwives. We need to be saying to the family, first of all, like a good midwife, we've already discussed this earlier. And this is that breathing that tells me this person's completely unconscious, they're not feeling the back of their throat. They are completely safe. It sounds very weird and distressing for you, but it does not mean that they are distressed. So that was the kind of cunning plan.
Now, you discussed that in that 4-minute video that you did, in my humble opinion. I'm wondering if you can tell us just a wee bit about that and how the reaction has been.
So that was a really interesting thing. I was invited to speak at a national festival of ideas. So that's not scary at all, is it? And
sounds kind of intimidating.
Yeah, and worse than that, it was in my city. That's what hosts it. It's hosted by the BBC, but in the big music centre in my city. So there was going to be a home crowd. And while I was there, one of the BBC people came up to me and said, look, we've started this little podcast site. We're making little 4-minute clips of interesting ideas. So a lot of the people who are speaking at the Ideas Festival are going to do a 4-minute for us. Will you do one? So I went, you do know I'm going to talk about dying, don't you? They said, yes, marvellous. So the woman who was the producer and director turned out also to be the sound engineer. And there was another woman working with her who did the lighting and the camera. And basically the three of us got into a cupboard in this big music centre because we needed to be somewhere that was quiet. And I described what it is that I'm so passionate about people understanding. And then they edited it to be, it's just under 4 minutes, isn't it? And I am not a person who has ever said, in my humble opinion, in my life, but their series was called In My Humble Opinion, so I had to keep saying that, yeah. So they made this little video, and they sent me a run of it before they'd tarted it up. And I didn't sound like I was saying anything too stupid, so that was okay. And then they sent me the finished thing, which has got this really ponderous, miserable piano music behind it. And then they stuck it up on the BBC website, but of course they stuck it up on the BBC website all over the world. So over the next few days, I noticed that so Lionel Shriver, the writer, was another one of the people who was recording her humble opinion about something else. And she and I had been at a dinner for the speakers, so again, utterly terrifying. And I was watching, and her video got up to, 5,000 views, 10,000 views, 28,000 views. I thought, I'm never going to get anything like that. And then I looked at mine, and it was 120,000 views. And then I started getting messages from people around the world, and I wasn't doing social media at this point, so I didn't realize quite what was happening. But it had been posted on Facebook. And within a very short amount of time, it had surpassed 1 million views. It's now more than 3.5 million views. And very touchingly, I had an email from some people somewhere in the southern United States who all worked for a veterinarian. And they'd been watching the man who ran this veterinary practice becoming thinner and weaker, and they could see that he wasn't well, and he was fine. He was fine. They didn't need to worry. And then one day he phoned and said he wasn't really well enough to come into work today. And during that day, he took to his bed and died. And he hadn't discussed this with anybody. But they had to find all of the accounts and the clients. And so they were going through his computer system, and they found in his favourites downloaded this In My Humble Opinion video, and he'd clearly known, and he'd been using that as something that I hope perhaps would have consoled him, because he clearly wasn't talking to anybody about the process he knew was happening to him.
And my sense is that similar things, of course, have been happening with your books, that people are looking at them, reading them, taking them in, and finding sources of comfort. And I'm wondering, with that in mind, in my humble opinion, might it be a time for you to share with us a taste of what that book is like, and perhaps read a selection?
Let's read a little bit. You can tell we planned this early. What shall we do to them, we said. How shall we upset them the most? This is a story that's quite early in With the End in Mind. With the End in Mind isn't in date order. It kind of skips about through my medical career from, witless medical student to relatively sensible senior clinician. But this story is from when I hadn't been working very long in a hospice, because originally my career plan had been to be a cancer doctor, and so I'd spent 4 years in acute medicine and in cancer services, getting that kind of expertise. And I'd chosen to look after people in the places where people were sickest because I needed to be able to have that expertise. So intensive care units, emergency rooms, the regional leukemia team, those sorts of things. So by the time I went to work in a hospice, I'd seen quite a lot of people dying. There was a patient in the hospice who we were all, frankly, we were all a bit frightened of her. She was French. She's called Sabine in the book. Obviously, I had to change everybody's characteristics because there was no way of getting permission from them to tell their stories. And Sabine was this kind of very mysterious, beautiful, aloof French widow. And she'd come to England with a British airman she'd married at the end of the Second World War. She'd been in the French resistance, and he had parachuted into France to help her resistance cell. So they'd never had children, which was a great sorrow to them. But she was so self-contained, so particular, and had such a strong French accent, which I will not attempt. And my boss, the consultant in charge of the hospice, was of French parentage. So very unusually for Sabine, she was able to chit-chat with him and make small talk in French. And sometimes in the evenings, he would just sit and chat to her. And they developed quite a close friendship. Actually, she flirted with him. And that was quite interesting to see. So one day, Sabine confessed to one of the nurses as she was helping her get dressed after she'd been bathed, that she was terrified of dying in overwhelming pain. Now, this nurse could have said, well, you don't need to worry about that, Sabine, because we've got really good drugs for that these days. But she didn't. She said, tell me what frightens you. And Sabine explained to her that if she were to be overwhelmed by pain on her deathbed, she might despair in God. And if she were to despair in God on her deathbed, she would die in a state of mortal sin. And because she was a French Roman Catholic, that was a really big deal, because it would mean that she couldn't go to heaven, which is where she was sure her husband was waiting for her. He died after a heart attack about 10 years before. So the nurse came down to the office to tell my boss this, and he said, well, we need to go and deal with this right now. He said to me, you come, you'll find this interesting. And I thought we were going to go and do a talk about pain. What happened next has lived with me as if on a cinema reel for the rest of my career. It formed my future practice. It's writing this book. It's enabled me to watch dying in a way that's informed and prepared, to be calm amidst other people's storms of fear, and to be confident that the more we understand about the way dying proceeds, the better we will manage it. I didn't see it coming, but it changed my life. So Sabine arranges us all. The nurse gets the chair, I get the little stool that's almost on the floor, and our leader gets the bed beside Sabine. There were French pleasantries, and then our leader came to the point. Your nurse told me that you have some worries. I'm really glad you told her. Would you like to discuss this with me? She agreed, and she suggested we speak in English for the others. And so he began. Have you been worrying? Oh, you've been worrying about what dying will be like and whether it will be painful for you. Yes, she replied. I was startled by his direct approach, but Sabine appeared unsurprised. And you've been worrying that your courage may fail. Sabine reached for his hand and grasped it. She swallowed and croaked, oui. I wonder whether it would help you if I describe what dying will be like, he said, looking straight into her eyes. And I wonder whether you have ever seen anyone die from the illness that you have. If he describes what? I heard myself shriek in my head. Sabine, focused and thoughtful, reminisced that during the war, a young woman had died of gunshot wounds in her family's farmhouse. They'd given her drugs that relieved her pain. Soon after, she stopped breathing. Years later, Sabine's beloved husband had died after a heart attack. He'd collapsed at home and survived to reach hospital. He died the following day, fully aware that death was approaching. The priest came. Peter said all the prayers with him. He never looked afraid. He told me goodbye was the wrong word, that this was au revoir, until we see each other again. Her eyes were brimming, and she blinked her tears into her cheeks, ignoring them as they ran into her wrinkles. My leader asked about her pain, and they had a short conversation about that. And then he says, if it hasn't been painful so far, I don't expect it to suddenly change character and become painful in the future, but if it does, you can be sure we'll help you to keep any pain bearable. Can you trust us to do that? Yes, I trust you. He continues. It's a funny thing that in many different illnesses that cause people to become weaker, their experience towards the end of life is very similar. I've seen this many times. Shall I tell you what we see? If you want me to stop at any point, you just tell me, and I will stop. She nods, holding his gaze. Well, the first thing we notice is that people are more tired. Their illness saps their energy. I think you're already noticing that. Another nod. She takes his hand again. As time goes by, people become more tired, more weary. They need to sleep more to boost their energy levels. Have you noticed that if you have a sleep during the day, that you feel less weary for a time when you wake up? Her posture is changing. She is sitting up straighter. Her eyes are locked on his face. She nods. Well, that tells us that you are following the usual pattern. What we expect to happen from now on is that you will just be progressively more tired, and you will need longer sleeps and spend less time awake. Job done, I think. She can expect to be sleepy. Let's go. But our leader keeps talking. As time goes by, he says, we find that people begin to spend more time sleeping. And some of that time, they're even more deeply asleep. They slip into a coma. I mean, they are unconscious. Do you understand? Shall I say it in French? No, I understand. Unconscious, coma, oui. She shakes his hand in hers to affirm her understanding. So if people are too deeply unconscious to take their medications for part of the day, we'll find a different way to give those drugs to make sure they remain in comfort. Consoler toujours. Yes, he must be about to stop now, I think. I'm surprised that he's told us so much, but he continues, his gaze locked onto hers. We see people spending more time asleep, less time awake. It seems that people don't notice when they become unconscious, and so at the very end of life, the person is simply unconscious all of the time, and then their breathing starts to change. Sometimes deep and slow, sometimes shallow and faster, and then very gently the breathing slows down and very gently stops. No sudden rush of pain at the end, no feeling of fading away, no panic, just very, very peaceful. She's leaning towards him. She picks up his hand and draws it to her lips and very gently kisses it with great reverence. He stops and looks at her. She looks at him. I stare at both of them. I think my mouth might be open. I may even be leaking from my eyes. There is a long silence. Her shoulders relax and she settles against her pillows. She closes her eyes and gives a deep, long sigh, then raises his hand, held in both of hers, shakes it like shaking dice, and gazes at him, and she says simply, "Thank you." She closes her eyes. We are, it seems, dismissed.
Kathryn, this morning at Medical Rounds, you also talked about another case that illustrated similar dynamics, this inability for us to look at evidence, make sense of evidence, and draw conclusions as to what this evidence should lead us to, which is that this person is on a pathway towards death. And you described an elderly woman that you were aware of living in northern Scotland, and I'm wondering if you might share a little bit of that with us.
Yeah, so that was another interesting case, not my patient, but a patient I was quite interested in, an elderly lady who was on holiday in her second home in Scotland. And a woman with quite a lot of responsibilities, but clearly becoming more unwell, and with a troubled grandson who lives in the United States. You probably knew her as the Queen. And as the BBC was announcing that the royal family were rushing to Balmoral because the Queen was unwell, they were finishing their bulletins with, "Get well soon, Mom." She died about hours after the first announcement was made. So, what happened to the Queen? Was it an unexpected death? Well, about 2 years before this, the Queen started walking with a stick. Nobody touches the Queen. Donald Trump didn't get the memo, but nobody else touches the Queen. So she has to make her own way in and out of vehicles and up steps and things like that. Prince Philip was allowed to guide her with an elbow, but then, of course, her husband died, devastating after so many years. Over that 18-month period, increasingly, she would take another member of the royal family with her for things, and she would sit down more and they would do more active stuff. And sometimes she would send another member of the royal family instead of her because she apparently had mobility issues, because we weren't allowed to say, "She's 94 for heaven's sake, and she's just exhausted." So as time went by, you're hearing a pattern here, she did less and less and took more and more rest. And she had more and more substitute speakers for her. But something that was really important to her was the COP27 conference in Glasgow. And when she cancelled that at the last minute and there wasn't a substitute royal to go, it was clear to me that she was, her energy was now failing unpredictably, and she was going to be dead very soon. And so there was clearly a piece of outstanding business that needed to be finished, and the world was watching Boris Johnson. And yeah, I know. And then the election of a new leader for the Conservative Party, whom she would have to appoint as the new Prime Minister because they were the party in office. But actually, I think she had unfinished business that was nothing to do with affairs of state. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that her troubled grandson was on the island at the point where she suddenly became much more sick. So she had been dying in plain sight for 2 years. Get well soon, Mom, is utterly ridiculous. We've got to be able to talk about what happens to us as human beings as our health fails, either because we have an illness or because we are aging or because of all of the above.
So with the End in Mind comes out, it's spectacularly successful, nominated for very prestigious literary awards. You become one of the most recognized voices in the world of palliative care. But it's not the end of the literary path. What comes next, and how do we arrive at Listen?
Okay, so I've become a serial offender, and I didn't anticipate that. I really thought that with the End in Mind was the stories that I wanted to tell, and I've come here and I've said this. But it turns out that if you write a book that becomes a bestseller, which this one did, and I still can't quite say that whole sentence without being amazed. Anyway, marvelous that it did, because it means that it gets to more people, and it's all about the stories. And I say at events like this, please buy a copy of the book and then please lend it to all of your friends. And my publishers say, will you stop saying that, because they want to sell books. But because it was successful, they wanted a second book. And I kept saying, I've said what I came to say, thank you. And then the correspondence from the book started. Two sorts of correspondence. So one was the sort of correspondence as I expected, which was about the process of dying. And I still feeling very guilty very early on about it, telling stories without permission, even though I changed everything I could, or sought permission from the families where I couldn't disguise the stories enough. But about 3, 4, 5 days after the book came out, somebody found my family Facebook account. I didn't know people you didn't know could do that. Sent me a direct message. And the message was, I sat with my mum when she was dying 8 years ago. It was unbearable watching and listening to her dragging her breath in and out, choking, gargling, drowning. After 2 years, my doctor diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, and I've been in having psychiatric help and therapy for the last 5 years. Yesterday, I read the story of Sabine in your book. And last night, I slept through the night for the first time in 8 years. And I just thought, I think the people whose stories I've told, I think they'll forgive me, because they would have liked this kind of help and support as well. But the other feedback was people saying, okay, you've convinced us we have to talk about this, but how do you do that then? And lots of questions about how to have conversations, or people telling me that they needed to give somebody a really good talking to. And I've got a lot to say about communication. It's been part of my medical life, part of my therapeutic life, part of my family life. So I went back to my publishers and said, I have got an idea for another book. It's going to be about communication. And I'm not going to fight about the title. It's called Listen. And they didn't fight me about the title. So here it is.
And I'm sure we would all love to listen to a reading.
So my editor was really wise about this. When I said, I think I've got another book, she said, oh, that's great. In fact, she said, that's marvellous, darling. Because she's lovely. But also very wisely said to me, it shouldn't be another death book. And I was a bit daunted by that to start off with. But she was saying, no, use the whole of the lifespan this time, because these principles are universally applicable. So it's a book about the way we listen, and about the way sometimes we get in our own way by falling over ourselves to help and fix, instead of staying in a place where we can listen and help somebody tell their story so well that they understand it and see how they might find some of the solutions for themselves. So this chapter is called Using Silence, and it's about the way we sometimes get in our own way and what we might do about that. Craig has just picked up his teenage daughter from a night out with school friends. Tomorrow is Saturday. She can sleep late and then catch up with homework, art activities, and her music. It was easy to find her in the sports club car park. There was a jostling, laughing crowd of youngsters flitting like moths in the pools of light beneath the lampposts, glad to have finished the week with a game of football, that's soccer over here, and some social time in the sports club cafe bar. They can't drink alcohol, of course, but they like the music there. And they gather to chat, dance, and gossip, skittish and giddy on the freedom of a weekend ahead. Sasha waved him down, air-kissed the two girls beside her, and slid into the passenger seat, where she sits scrolling through photos on her phone, silent. Good night, Sasha, asked Craig, pulling out of the car park. Sasha doesn't reply. Her head is bowed to the phone screen that glows blue in the dark car interior. As they move between street lamps, orange flashes illuminate her face and her spiked purple hair. Glancing sideways, Craig sees a tear glistening on Sasha's cheek. Want to talk? He asks. The car curves into the darkness as the lamp-lit city street becomes a dark highway across the countryside. Craig drives, eyes ahead, silent, waiting. Sasha sniffs and blows her nose. They laughed at my shoes, she says glumly. Craig feels a surge of relief. Shoes, only a fashion tiff. He'd been as riled as a bear whose cub had been threatened. A surge of fatherly helpfulness sweeps through him as he says, "Oh, sweetheart, it's only shoes. What's the big deal? Come on, you're just tired. Let's get you home to bed. If you like, we can go shoe shopping next weekend, okay?" Sasha nods, turns off her phone, pulls up her scarf and closes her eyes. If he can't understand about the shoes, how can she tell him about the other stuff? Craig is glad he made his baby feel better. So we have a little bit of a description of the backstory. These shoes are flat, kingfisher blue or blue jay blue, shiny lace-up shoes, very fashionable, but not very ladylike. This girl has had leukemia in her childhood. She's had chemotherapy that's left her with nerve damage, and she can't quite feel where her feet are in space, so she can't wear the trendy high-heeled shoes that her girlfriends are wearing, but she's really, really proud of these boots. So the very kind author, borrowing a trick from Garrison Keillor, takes Craig around the block before he picks Sasha up. It's a bit early anyway, and he feels very protective of his daughter. Sasha walks more slowly than her friends. Sometimes on the football touchline, she has to be careful because the ground is uneven. She dressed carefully today because she had a special idea in mind for this evening. The patent leather air sole boots, an iridescent kingfisher blue with a confidence-boosting flourish of her outfit. At the after-football gatherings, Sasha has been getting to know Tony, the captain of the girls' football team. She's found a strange, sweet pleasure in Tony's company, as Sasha believes they're falling in love with each other. Tonight, Sasha planned to ask Tony on a date. But Tony didn't join the gang at the bar. She dashed straight from the changing rooms to the car park, where an older boy was waiting in his car. "Bye, everyone," she waved from the passenger seat window as her beau drove them to the exit. "See you on Monday." Sasha watched the car sweep out of the car park with her dreams on board, a ripping sensation pulling at her chest. "Come on, Sasha, you should be at the front of the queue in your shiny shoes," shouted a friend as they trudged across to the cafe. But the shoes are pointless. The hope is pointless. The love is pointless. Sasha's heart sank to her boots. These stupid, hopeful boots. She would like to throw them, pointless, yet stabbing her into the nearest bin. So now let's bring Craig back into the car park to pick Sasha up, broken heart and all. "Good night, Sasha?" asks Craig as they drive away. Sasha doesn't reply. Her eyes are fixed on her phone screen that glows inside the car. The light from the street lamps flashes across her face and her spiked purple hair. Craig sees a tear glistening on her cheek. "Want to talk?" he asks. "They laughed at my shoes," she says glumly. Craig is surprised. Sasha isn't usually fussed about teasing. "Oh, Sash, I'm sorry," he says, holding his thoughts to himself. "I thought you looked sad." Craig feels as riled as a bear whose cub has been threatened. His precious daughter is sad and some other kid has done this. He maintains a silence, glancing at Sasha from time to time as she scrolls and sighs. After several minutes, he prompts Sasha with, "I'll listen if you want to tell me about it, you know." Sasha puts down the phone. "I wore these boots specially, Dad. I chose them because I like someone who likes these boots. I wanted to show that we were on the same wavelength." Craig waits. This is Sasha talking about liking someone. She's never had a boyfriend, but she's reaching the age when all that starts to happen. His mind races to a million terrifying destinations: heartbreak, sex, pregnancy, more heartbreak, losing her to a boy who doesn't deserve her. He checks himself, remembering dating from his youth, remembers the fun and the awkwardness and the self-esteem crises. So you like someone, he invites, and falls silent again. Yes, and I thought they liked me too, she says, her voice choking miserably. Oh, that old unrequited love thing, he thinks, relieved. Heartbreak is all part of growing up, but it hurts so badly. He waits. So, what happened? Asks Craig into the dark silence beside them. They went off with somebody else, sighs Sasha. I didn't expect it, you know, I thought they liked me. Oh, that's hard, hun, says Craig. I hate that heartbreak feeling. But you've got Mum, and I've got nobody, she says. This wounds. Craig wants to say, you've got us. But well done, Craig, for keeping those thoughts inside his head. He nods in the darkness. He waits. Nobody will ever love me, sobs Sasha. Craig wants to tell her there are plenty more fish in the sea, that she'll meet someone, there's plenty of time. But those consolations aren't for now, while her heartbreak is raw. I guess I read too much into it. Sasha is mulling it over. I mean, we talked about boots and football, and we both like the same music, and we just seemed to click, you know? But I hoped for more, and I was excited to think maybe they did too, so I feel silly as well. But at least I hadn't said anything, I haven't been humiliated. And another tear glistens silver in the passing calm. Sasha is using this silence to review her hopes and assumptions. Did Tony encourage her, or did Sasha misread their friendship? Is her hope of happiness over forever, or has she discovered something about relationships? Does her dad realize that Sasha is talking about a girl? Is he ready for her to come out? Is she ready to come out? There's a lot more to be unpeeled when Sasha is ready to tell it. But this dark calm, this patient dad, this open-minded silence has given her a safe place to begin. This is definitely not about shoes. Well done for holding the silence, Craig.
It's time for us to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have something that they would like to ask Dr. Mannix? Or do we have any questions online, John?
They are watching but not feeling inquisitive at the moment.
Remember, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm good with silence. Sit here. Yes.
Can you speak to us just a little bit about the body that won't give up and the family that tries to tell the person it's okay to go? You must have some experience with that.
Okay, that's a really great question. So the timing of dying is what we're talking about here, isn't it? And that we see strange things about the timing. People who are so sick that we thought they would be dead a long time ago, who are still hanging on and we don't understand why. And then the longed for message arrives of the baby has been born, the exam has been passed, or the longed for visitor comes, or their voice is heard on a screen. And then within hours, the dying that has taken weeks is over and we don't understand it. The person who's been dying for a while, the family's got a rota, they're never on their own, there's always two people there. And the 1 30-second interval where one person went to the bathroom and another person went out to take a phone call is the moment that the person stops breathing. And these phenomena are so repetitive that it's hard to know whether it's just that we notice them because we're expecting them, or whether in fact they are more like they're happening more than would be likely by chance. Hard to know statistically, but it feels like a thing. And another one of the things is this thing that you're talking about, that the person seems to be on the brink of dying and yet somehow the letting go isn't happening. Now, sometimes it's because they're dying of a thing that's making part of their body not well enough to sustain them, but the rest of their body as well. So young people with brain tumours, for example, can take a long time to do their dying because although their brain is no longer working properly, they've got a physically robust body. But we don't really understand it. There still are some mysteries left. And very often we encourage families to give the person permission. You know, we're going to be okay, Dad. We'll look after Mum. That kind of conversation. So I encouraged my mum to do that when my 97-year-old Nana was dying. So there is something interesting about very elderly people who almost die a young person's death. They've been so fit to get to this age. And Mum was saying, so it's okay to go, Mum. You can go now. We're all with you. We'll be fine. You can go. And my Nana, who had been dying for 3 days, opened one eye and said, go where?
That's great. We still have a few minutes. Yes.
Do you have any experience with people who died and then came back?
Oh, so near-death experiences. Yeah, I've met a few people who have near-death experiences, and it's really interesting. There's quite a big literature about that as well. So the people who I've met have all found the experience that they've had very reassuring. And the majority of people who have a near-death experience find that it's a peaceful experience, but not everybody. So it is really important we don't pretend that it's all marvelous and lovely, just as we mustn't pretend that every deathbed is comfortable and peaceful. But I think it's a little bit like air travel. You know, if you only knew about air travel, what you read in the newspapers or see on the news, would you ever get on a plane? And you wouldn't, would you? And I've been making that act of faith of getting on a lot of planes over the last 3 weeks. And that's because I recognise that there is a truth that there are air disasters, but it's a tiny slice, oh, sorry everyone, a tiny slice of a massive pie. And it's true that there are difficult deaths as well, but it's a tiny slice of a massive pie. So people who have had near-death experiences often are sad not to have died, even though they felt sad to be dying when they first took really sick. And I looked after an elderly man who was so looking forward to seeing his twin sister again. And they both had diphtheria when they were children, and he survived and she died. And his near-death experience was when he was a middle-aged man, and he found himself in this beautiful countryside place, walking up a meadow full of flowers, and he could see his twin sister at the top of the hill next to a stile, and he wanted to climb the stile and join her. And she told him that he wasn't allowed to come yet, and he was devastated. But he went back down the hill and woke up in hospital, and he'd actually had a heart attack and hadn't been aware of any of that. But he'd carried that image of his sister waiting for him, and he told me all about it because he was within days of dying, and he said, I know exactly what's going to happen, I know where I'll be, I know she'll be waiting for me, and it gave him great confidence. So it's fascinating.
We have time for one more quick question, if we might.
I've so enjoyed this, thank you. I'm wondering if some cultures are better at death than others.
Oh, absolutely they are. Absolutely they are. And the more wealthy we are, the more we displace dying into hospital because we can afford the care that sometimes postpones dying for a while. And that's good because, you know, young people with their lives in front of them, it would be nice if we could prevent them from dying at 25 and let them get to 75 instead. It's not a bad thing that we're postponing it, but it means we've stopped accompanying it. And in less high-income countries and in groups who've preserved a culture of family-centeredness, including in high-income countries, what we see is, first of all, that the autonomy of the person isn't as important as the well-being of a whole family together. So a family will gather around a person who's very sick and support them. Some cultures won't mention why, or they'll only talk in metaphor about it. Some cultures think that you bring the death by talking about it. So we have to be really careful about how we deal with that. I was in New Zealand a few years ago, and I was learning a lot about Maori culture and Maori end-of-life care. And they have the process, as you do here in Canada, of advanced care planning. The New Zealand government was trying to roll it out. They made a really beautiful advanced care planning paper book so families could sit and talk it through and write it down. And it was designed by people with consultation of the European origin majority, the biggest minority, which is Maori, and then there were lots of people from different areas around the Pacific. All those cultures were represented in the discussions. The final version was agreed, and then it was published. The only thing they hadn't agreed was the cover. And the cover had turning leaves on it, and it said, "My plan." And the whole Maori community said that won't work. It has to be our plan. So it's really, really interesting, but a lot of wisdom that hasn't been forgotten in those societies, and we need to turn to them with humility and learn from them. Great question, thank you.
Kathryn, thank you for coming to Winnipeg, and thank you for making the world a better place, one reader and one listener at a time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so very much. So we will now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll just ask you to remain in your seats for one moment while we safely transport Dr. Mannix to the table. There are copies of both Listen and With the End in Mind at the table. There are also some at our cash desk. So please feel free to avail yourself of a signature before you pay for the book. Just please do pay for the book before you leave. We're so very grateful to you all for being here tonight, both here and virtually. So very grateful to Dr. Harvey Chochinov for coming on board to not only help organize this evening, but also to host it with such natural aplomb. And of course, I'd like to invite you all to join me in thanking one more time Dr. Kathryn Mannix.